Hello, good morning. Could you all hear me? Yes, excellent. It's great to be here. Thank you, Niall. Thank you for organising this, and thanks for the introduction. Well done for those of you who've made it on time. It was a bit of a marathon getting here this morning, wasn't it? So sorry. So the sort of pun my dad makes. But anyway, great that you're all here, and I'm looking forward to today. I hope what I have to present today will make your trip worth it. I know for a fact the other presenters will make your trip worth it. But I hope mine will also be of use and interest to all of you. Now, before I get on with my presentation, I'd just like to say just a few words about me and who I am, and my background, and so on and so forth. So, my name's James Davis. My doctorate was in medical and social anthropology, focusing on mental health. And I've trained as a psychotherapist, an adult psychotherapist, and indeed practiced as a therapist in different organisations, such as the NHS, and also for the organisation Mind. When I worked for the NHS, I worked in an outpatient psychotherapy unit, receiving referrals from the wards and also from primary care. And it was while working in that setting that I started to become quite concerned with some of the more traditional forms of psychiatric intervention and practice that I was witness to. For example, when it came to psychiatric diagnoses, I often found that these diagnoses created the illusion of understanding among me and my peers. I also felt that these diagnoses were generating stigma in the people I was working with, and also leading them to become confused about the real nature of their distress. When it came to the psychiatric medications, while it is true, and I certainly subscribe to this notion, that for some people, the most severely distressed members of our society, these medications can be experienced as very useful, certainly when taken in the short term, and I accept that principle. For me, working in the NHS, it felt that there was a huge amount of unnecessary over-prescribing. And in addition to that, a lot of prescribing that was going on for far too long, prescribing that ultimately, in my view, was doing more harm than good. So as a consequence of these experiences, which I culminated over a series of years, I started to read voraciously the critical psychiatry literature to find out a little bit more about what potentially could be going wrong. And after a few years of consulting this literature, I decided personally to make my own contribution to this particular canon. And I decided to do that by way of not writing an academic article for clinicians and for fellow academics, but rather for writing the kind of book I felt the people I was seeing in the room might benefit from reading. So I wanted to write a book for the general reader in order to reach the people who were on the receiving end of psychiatric drugs and diagnoses. Because in my view, it felt that many such people were subjecting themselves to psychiatric interventions without having the satisfactory information in order to make an informed decision as to whether or not to subject themselves to this form of intervention. And that's why I decided to write the book I did, to provide them with that information I felt they needed in order to make an informed choice as to whether to subject themselves to these interventions or not. So that book, that project culminated in a book called Cracked: Why Psychiatry is Doing More Harm Than Good. I published that a few years ago. And when it was published, and I think still today, that book advanced a position that is both countercultural and counterintuitive. The position goes like this: that psychiatry over the last 30 years, under the dominance of the biomedical model, has started to become bad for our mental health. Now, there are a number of reasons why I argue this to be the case. I'm just going to focus on two quickly before focusing on one in particular in the first part of my lecture today. The first reason is that psychiatric drugs do not do what they say they do on the tin. They're more ineffectual and dangerous than many of us have been led to suppose. The second point is that the links between the pharmaceutical industry and psychiatry have become far too cozy in recent decades. And this is biased psychiatry towards privileging psychopharmaceutical treatments in the management of emotional distress. And indeed, that is the argument I'm going to focus on in particular in the second part of today's lecture. The final point I want to make, and this is the one I'm going to focus on in the first part of today's lecture, is that psychiatry has wrongly medicalized more and more people in contemporary society. So apparently, 1 in 4 of us now suffers from a mental health disorder in any given year. And I'm going to argue that this figure is so startlingly high because psychiatry has simply renamed more and more of our natural and normal, albeit painful human experiences as indicating psychiatric disorders that oftentimes require some kind of psychiatric drug. So in effect, by reclassifying painful normality as psychiatric abnormality, we have created the illusion of a psychiatric epidemic. Now, I'm not suggesting here that the suffering itself is illusory. No, that is absolutely real. It demands attention and it demands care. What I'm contesting is the notion that this suffering is psychiatric in nature. Okay. So, what is at the heart of this illusion? Well, I'm going to argue today that at the heart of this illusion sits a book called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the book that includes all of the mental disorders that psychiatry believes to exist. Now, there are many interesting things about this book, but one in particular that stands out for me is that this book has expanded at a faster rate than almost any other medical manual in history. So, for example, in the early 1960s, this book included around 100 disorders, whereas today it includes around 370. So what is going on? Well, that's the question I set out to answer in part of the book I was writing, but I encountered an immediate problem, and it was this. There was very little documentary evidence chartering the processes that the committees who wrote DSM followed when they put that manual together. So I quickly realized, if I were to write some kind of reconstruction of events, then I would have to go and speak to the people who wrote DSM. And that's what I did. I started with someone called Dr. Robert Spitzer, who's now generally regarded to be the most influential psychiatrist of the 20th century because he was chairperson of DSM-3, published in 1980. He headed a team of around 9 people, which was called the Task Force, remember that phrase, the Task Force, who wrote and put that manual together. Now, the reason I'm going to start with DSM-3 today, and by the way, there have been 5 editions of DSM over its history, the most recent being DSM-5, published in May 2013. But the reason I'm going to start with DSM-3 is because by far it is the most important edition in the manual's history for the following reasons. It established the modern diagnostic system under which we still operate today. So we call it the checklist system. If you experience this number of symptoms for this amount of time, then you warrant this diagnosis, right? That checklist system was created in DSM-3. Number 2, DSM-3 introduced 80 brand new mental disorders, many of the household name disorders with which you may be familiar. Disorders like attention deficit disorder, or post-traumatic stress disorder, or major depression, etc., and so forth. And finally, DSM-3 significantly lowered the bar for what constitutes having one of these disorders. In other words, it made it far easier to get diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder. So for these reasons, I'm going to focus on DSM-3 first before moving on to DSM-4. But before I get to that, I just want to say for a moment, in what I'm about to present to you now, this is a composite of the interview data I gathered from speaking to the leading members of the DSM task force, the interviews I conducted with them, and also the archival research I undertook at the American Psychiatric Association in Washington, D.C., where they house all of the DSM documents, the documents pertaining to the construction of DSM, and I've made 2 separate trips to those archives in order to familiarize myself with those documents. But let me just, before I get to that data, first set the scene. So I'll just tell you a brief story. A few years ago, I'm in my office at the University of Roehampton, and it really strikes me, I really need to speak to this guy called Dr. Robert Spitzer. So I think, well, look, let me go online, let me find his telephone number. So I search online, and I find this number, and I think, well, I'll give it a call. So I give him a call from my office in London, and this lady answers the phone, and I just kind of assume, rightly or wrongly, I assume that it's his secretary. So I say, oh, hello, my name's Dr. James Davis. I'm calling from London. I'd love to be able to book an appointment to speak to Professor Robert Spitzer at some point. Would that be possible? And then she responds by saying, hold on. Robert! What have you want? And I'm like, what? This is not what I expected. And she goes, someone on the phone. And by the way, I'm not going to do any more American accents for the rest of the day. And suddenly, hello? Oh, okay, that's that one, that's it. And it's Robert Spitzer. And I say, oh, hi, I'm James Davis. I'd like to interview you. And so he says, well, what do you want to know? Let's have a conversation now. So I said, well, can I record this? Yeah, fine. So I get my computer and and we have a conversation for an hour off the cuff. At the end of that conversation, I say to him, listen, Robert, this has been absolutely fascinating. Do you mind if we carry on this conversation? I'll come to the US. Why don't I come to the US and meet you, and we'll carry on this conversation? And he said, fine. Just let me know when, and we'll arrange it. So I go to my head of department. I say, listen, I've got to speak to this guy. Could you fund the trip? And they say, fine, we'll fund the trip. So I head off to the United States 6 months later. So 6 months later, I get on a train from New York City, take the train out through New Jersey to Princeton University. And Robert Spitzer's now lives in one of those lovely New England homes just northeast of the university. So I get a cab, and I head out there, and the cab pulls up outside, and it's this beautiful old home, and it's clear they've chosen a lovely place to live. I walk up to the front door, I knock on the door, and Robert Spitzer opens the door. And he's standing there, and he's got this loose sports top on, he's wearing shorts, and he's wearing sandals, and he says, James, coming in. And one of the first things he says is, James, do you want to stay for lunch? And I just had one of those mountainous American breakfasts, you know? I thought, oh, no. So I said, yes, that would be nice. And he said, to my great relief, look, before we have lunch, why don't we sit down so I can tell you what you want to know? So I go into his living room, we sit down, I set up my computer, I press record, and off we go. Now, one of the first questions I had for Robert Spitzer was this. What was the rationale for this huge expansion of the DSM that happened under your watch? Remember, 80 brand new mental disorders went into that manual. What was the rationale for that? And this is how he responded. The disorders we included weren't really new to the field. They were mainly diagnoses that clinicians used in practice, but which weren't recognized by the DSM. So by including them in the DSM, we gave them professional recognition. So presumably these disorders had been discovered in a biological sense. That's why they were included, right? No, not at all. There are only a handful of mental disorders in the DSM known to have a clear biological cause. These are known as the organic disorders. These are few and far between. So let me get this clear. There are no discovered biological causes for many of the remaining mental disorders in the DSM. It's not for many, it's for any. No biological markers have been identified. Let me just say something here for a moment. Now, the reason why this may sound strange to many people, maybe not necessarily people in this room, but people out there in wider society, is because people expect psychiatry to work much like the rest of modern mainstream medicine. In modern mainstream medicine, and of course there are exceptions to this, but broadly speaking, a name will only be ratified as indicating the existence of the disorder after some kind of pathological roots have been discovered in the body, in the cells, in the tissues, in the organs, etc. But the surprising thing about psychiatry is that it works in completely the opposite way. Psychiatry first names a disorder before any pathological roots have been discovered in the body. So in effect, a new mental disorder can make it into the DSM and become part of our wider culture, even though there is no biological evidence whatsoever to support its inclusion. So I continued. So if there are known biological causes, on what grounds do mental disorders make it into the DSM? What other evidence supports their inclusion? Well, psychiatry has to look for other things, behavioral, psychological. We have other procedures. I then asked him what these procedures were. I guess our general principle was that if a large enough number of clinicians felt that a diagnostic concept was important in their work, then we were likely to add it as a new category. That was essentially it. It became a question of how much consensus there was to recognize and include a particular disorder. So it was agreement that determined what went into the DSM. That was essentially how it went. Right. Another point to make here, agreement does not constitute scientific proof, right? If a group of theologians all get together and agree that God exists, this doesn't prove that God exists. All it proves is that this group of theologians believe it does. So in what sense is DSM committee agreement different? Why, when a group of psychiatrists comes together and agrees upon something, should the rest of us accept they have got it right? Well, the obvious answer to that question would be, well, surely there are other forms of research that are guiding the committee in the agreements they reach, and that would be fair enough. So let me deal with that point now, and let me deal with it by drawing into the conversation a professor of psychology at Harvard Kennedy School, someone called Paula J. Kaplan. Now, Paula is very interesting because she was a consultant to DSM-3, but more importantly, because she lobbied Robert Spitzer not to include a new disorder that was proposed for inclusion. This disorder was called self-defeating personality disorder, or SDPD for short. Now, she argued that this diagnosis was very dangerous because the characteristics of SDPD were very similar to the characteristics that women displayed when they had been victims of violence. So in other words, she argued that this diagnosis could be used to pathologize female victims of violence. They were suffering because they had a self-defeating personality disorder, not because they've just been abused. But also, it could let the perpetrators of such violence off the hook, because presumably they were just doing what these women wanted. The women had a self-defeating personality disorder. The men, or whomever the abusers were simply obliging. So for this reason, she argued it was a dangerous diagnosis and it shouldn't be included. But Spitzer remained adamant. He did not want to get rid of the diagnosis. And when I was at the DSM archives in Washington, D.C., by the way, there are 9 lineal feet of documents there. I'm sifting through a box and I find this little tag which reads SDPD. And I go down and I pull out this document and I find the very meeting in which Robert Spitzer and his team are discussing Paula J. Kaplan's argument. And I'm just going to show you a transcript of that minuted meeting here, verbatim, because I think it's quite interesting. It says the following: they, the women, present a narrow-gauged but persuasive argument. Their powerful argument is that it is a political hot potato. The feminist issue is a false one, that this diagnosis could pathologize female victims of violence. Think, women's arguments seem irrelevant to questions on the table. They are obscuring their own good arguments. The good arguments being that SDPD is a controversial diagnosis, the irrelevant arguments being those posed by Kaplan. Benedek, no empirical basis for category, but you're right, arguments aren't responsive to questions. Rose, we do great disservice by backing off and not acknowledging that this pattern is pathological. So from this, you see they're saying, no, we're going to keep it in the DSM. And they do keep us in the DSM. But in a last-ditch attempt to try and influence them against doing this, Paula J. Kaplan launches on the final strategy. I decide to scrutinize thoroughly the very research used to justify including SDPD in the DSM. Let's have a look now at what she found. Firstly, she found only 2 pieces of research, which is a remarkably small amount by anyone's standards. But now let's have a look at what that research constitutes. In the first piece of research, which was conducted by Robert Spitzer, a group of psychiatrists at only one university who all accepted that SDPD existed were shown some old clinical case studies. Kaplan pointed out that just because some psychiatrists at one hospital all diagnosed their patients with SDPD was not proof that the disorder actually exists. All it proves, as Kaplan said, is that a group of psychiatrists working at the same institution gave the same label, rightly or wrongly, to a given set of behaviors. It proves nothing more than that. But if you think that first piece of research is weak, then just consider the second piece. A questionnaire was sent to a selected number of members of the American Psychiatric Association. This asked them whether the diagnosis SDPD should be included in the DSM. An official report later conducted by the psychologists Cutchins and Kirch showed that only 11% voted yes, which is surely not a representative sample of the psychiatric community. So that is the research basis for including SDPD in the DSM. Now you could say to me, look, James, fair enough, but look, surely this is an outlier. You're cherry-picking the most extreme example in order to rubbish the whole process. That's what you're doing. The research basis for the other disorders was far more robust. Now, if you were to make that argument, that would be a fair argument to make. So let me deal with it now. And I'm going to deal with it by inviting into the discussion somebody called Dr. Theodore Millon. And by the way, Dr. Theodore Millon was a member of the original task force, so he was privy to everything that went on. In the following quote, this is what he says about the research not only supporting the inclusion of SDPD, but all of the other disorders that went into DSM. This is what he says. There was very little systematic research, and much of the research that existed was really a hodgepodge, scattered, inconsistent, and ambiguous. I think the majority of us recognize that the amount of good, solid science upon which we were making our decisions was pretty modest. So let me now go back to sitting in Robert Spitzer's front room back in Princeton. I decide to read to Robert this quote to see what he made of it. And after a short and a slightly uncomfortable silence, Robert Spitzer responded in a way I simply had not expected. He said the following: "Well, it is certainly true that for many of the disorders that were added, there wasn't a tremendous amount of research. And certainly there wasn't research on the particular way we define these disorders. In the case of Millen's quote, I think he's mainly referring to the personality disorders. But again, it is certainly true that the amount of research validating data on most psychiatric disorders is very limited indeed." So you're saying that there was little research not only supporting your inclusion of new disorders, but also supporting how these disorders should be defined? There are very few disorders whose definition was a result of specific research data. So I was so surprised by this admission that when I returned to the UK some days later, I decided to check it out with other members of his task force. So on a rainy English morning, I decided to call at his office in New York City someone called Professor Donald Klein. Now, Professor Donald Klein is a really important figure in the history of DSM. He was second in command to Robert Spitzer, but actually from the archives, it turns out he probably had, in many areas, almost more influence than Robert Spitzer. So a key player in the history of DSM. I called him and I read to him what Spitzer had said to me to see what he made of it. And this is how he responded. "Sure, we had very little in the way of data, so we were forced to rely on clinical consensus, which admittedly is a very poor way to do things. But it was better than anything else we had. So, without data to guide you, how was this consensus reached?" I asked for an example. "We thrashed it out, basically. We had a 3-hour argument. There would be about 12 people sitting down at a table. Usually there was a chairperson and there was somebody taking notes. And at the end of each meeting, there would be a distribution of events. And at the next meeting, some would agree with the inclusion and others would continue arguing. If people were still divided, the matter would be eventually decided by a vote." A vote? Really? Sure. That is how it went. Right, so they're voting here. I'm interested. So the next person I speak to, Dr. Henry Pinsker, again, a member of the original 9, I decide to raise the issue of voting with him. And this is what he said. "Some things were discussed over a number of different meetings, which would sometimes be followed by an exchange of memoranda about it. And then there would simply be a vote. People would raise hands. There weren't that many people. Regarding the legitimacy of this method," Pinsker continued, "we never had any question that that was how we should proceed. I had no reservations at all about working that way." And just to confirm this was the case, when I was in the archives, I managed to source with the archivist 12-minuted task force meetings. And we could only source 12 because that's all we could find. And out of those 12-minuted task force meetings, there is evidence, clear evidence, of votes taking place in 10 of them. And we're not talking about 1 or 2 votes here. Lots and lots of votes on a whole host of different topics. In one of the documents, it was about 24 votes on loads of different things: how to define the disorders, where to set symptom thresholds, whether or not to include the disorders. In other words, the archival evidence absolutely supports what the oral history is saying. Oh, one point I just want to make about all of this. Voting isn't a scientific activity. What is it? It's a cultural activity. When anything is voted into existence, whatever it may be, whether it's a new president of the United States, whether it's a new union leader, whether or not it's a new mental disorder, the likelihood we've got it wrong is never far away. Okay, so let me give you... yes. Could I just introduce you to Rennie Garfinkel for a moment? Very interesting woman. She, during the construction of DSM-3, she just finished her training as a psychologist. So she was very young, very green, very naive and innocent, as we all are before we go out there into the big wide world. And she got a kind of internship at the APA, and she turned up one morning and she said, "What do I have to do?" And they said, "Oh, there's this thing going on upstairs called the DSM. Could you go up there and just help out, make coffee, photocopy, usual sorts of things?" "Yeah, fine." So she goes there. She doesn't know what she's part of. And she's sitting in the task force meetings. And as things roll on, she starts to realize she's actually part of something quite important here, and she's privy to some quite fascinating dynamics. So 30 or so years later, I decide to interview her. What was going on? What was happening? What did you observe? This is what she said. "You must understand, what I saw happening on these committees wasn't scientific. It more resembled a group of friends trying to decide where they want to go for dinner. One person says, 'I feel like Chinese food.' Another person says, no, I'm really more in the mood for Indian food. And finally, after some discussion and collaborative give and take, they all decide to go have Italian. She then gave me an example of how far down the scale of intellectual respectability she felt these meetings could sometimes fall. On one occasion, I was sitting in on a task force meeting, and there was a discussion about whether a particular behavior should be classed as a symptom of a particular disorder. And as the conversation went on, to my great astonishment, one task force member suddenly piped up, "Oh, no, we can't include that behavior as a symptom because I do that." And so it was decided that that behavior wouldn't be included because presumably if someone on the task force does it, it must be perfectly normal. All right, so let me just give you some more impressions of these meetings gathered by way of my interviews and other people, other sources I consulted. According to other members of the task force, these meetings were often haphazard affairs. Suddenly these things would happen and there didn't seem to be much basis for it except someone just decided all of a sudden to run with it, said one participant. It seemed, another member admitted, that the loudest voices usually won out. With no extensive data one could turn to, the outcome of task force decisions often depended on who in the room had the strongest personality. But the problem with relying on consensus, reiterated Garfinkel, is that in the discussion, some voices will just get quieter, either because they don't want to fight or because they see they're in the minority and snap. That's when the decision is made. Admittedly, when the task force lacked expertise on a particular disorder, Spitzer would consult the relevant leaders in the field, and the archives are full of these letters he was writing back and forth to the experts. But this also led to chaotic meetings that members often found difficult to participate in. One of the only British members of the task force, a psychiatrist called David Schaffer, recalled how such meetings often unfolded. In these meetings of the so-called experts or advisors, people would be standing and sitting and moving around. People would talk on top of each other, but Robert Spitzer, would be too busy typing notes to chair the meeting in an orderly way. Now, in 2005, a very interesting article was published in the New Yorker magazine, and the title of that article was A Dictionary of Disorder, and it was a biographical study of Robert Spitzer's influence on global psychiatry. And midway through that article, there's a section on the construction of DSM-3, which I just want to read to you very briefly. Roger Peel and Paul Lasada, psychiatrists at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., wrote a paper in which they used the term hysterical psychoses to describe the behavior of two kinds of patients they had observed. Spitzer read the paper and asked Peel and Lasada if he could come to Washington to meet them. During a 40-minute conversation, the three decided that hysterical psychoses should really be divided into two disorders, brief reactive psychosis and factitious disorder. Then Bob asked for a typewriter, Peel says. To Peel's surprise, Spitzer drafted the definitions on the spot. He banged out criteria sets for factitious disorder and for brief reactive psychosis, and it struck me that this was a productive fellow. He comes in to talk about an issue and walks away with diagnostic criteria for two different mental disorders. And by the way, both of those disorders went into the DSM with only very minor modification from the original criteria written up there and then in that room. Let me just read you two paragraphs before we move on. As Spitzer's DSM-3 was published in 1980, it became a sensation overnight. The almost 500-page long manual sold out immediately. The manual was purchased not only by psychiatrists, but by nurses, social workers, lawyers, psychologists, psychotherapists, etc. And the enthusiasm quickly spread far beyond the United States. In Britain, for example, the manual had such impact that by the end of the 1980s, most British psychiatrists were being trained to use DSM. Furthermore, Spitzer's DSM categories quickly became those that guided all research into psychiatric disorders internationally. This meant that the disorders that were studied by researchers in Germany, Australia, Canada, Britain, Scandinavia, and so on and so forth, were those defined and listed in Spitzer's DSM. In short, the book ultimately changed the fundamental nature of research and practice within the field, not to mention the lives of tens or countless millions diagnosed with the psychiatric disorders listed therein. And yet, as the influence of the manual spread, the truth about its construction remained obscure. Most professionals using the manual simply did not know, and I would say still do not know today, the extent to which biological evidence or solid research failed to guide the choices the task force made. They did not know that the definitions of the disorders contrived, the validity of the disorders included, and the symptom thresholds people must meet in order to receive the diagnosis were not decided on the basis of rigorous research, but were the product of committee decisions which, at best, reflected the well-meaning professional opinions of a small subset of psychiatrists. In short, most people did not know that the fundamental changes Spitzer brought to global psychiatry only required the consensus of an extremely small group of people, 9 people. And indeed, as Robert Spitzer openly confirmed to me in our interview, and actually I think this is my favorite quote of all, he said the following: "Our team was certainly not typical of the psychiatric community. And that was one of the major arguments against DSM-3. It allowed a small group with a particular viewpoint to take over psychiatry and change it in a fundamental way." What did you make of that criticism? What did I make of that charge? Well, it was absolutely true. It was a revolution. That's what it was. We took over because we had the power. Quite a striking confession. I actually got that quote the day after I was leaving, and I was at the hotel, and I was having breakfast the day after I interviewed, and I was really frustrated with myself because there were 2 or 3 questions I just didn't get in to the interview. So I thought, you know what, just call him. This guy usually answers the phone, so just call him. So I called him back, and I said, "I'm so sorry, Robert, a couple of things I just want to ask, which I forgot." And he said, go ahead, what are they? And I asked him about the criticisms of DSM, and this is what he said. And I recorded this on a fountain outside of one of those, Best Inns or something, sitting there, and I recorded it there, and this is what he said to me that morning. And I think it's really, really quite a powerful statement, because it's true. It's absolutely true. So much, another point I just want you to make here, so much of what goes on in mental health is to do with who has the power. It is absolutely to do with who has the power. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Shocking the extent to which this happens, not just on DS, but on all the committees that define how we are meant to understand and respond to emotional difficulties. Okay. All right. I've got 10 minutes left of this section. Is that okay, before we have a quick break? Because I want to move forward now into DSM-4. So not that much more to go, but stay with me, please. So in 1994, DSM-4 reaches the end of its shelf life and is replaced, DSM-3, sorry, and is replaced by DSM-4, which remains the DSM in use for 20 years, right up until May 2013, when it's replaced by DSM-5. Yeah. Okay, so in 2013, I had the opportunity to interview the new chairperson of DSM-4, Dr. Alan Francis, who took over from Robert Spitzer, on 2 separate occasions. And so one of the first questions I had to him was, with the benefit of hindsight, was there anything you did when constructing DSM-4 that you now regret? And this is what he had to say. Well, the first thing I have to say about that is that DSM-4 was a remarkably unambitious and modest effort to stabilize psychiatric diagnosis, not to create new problems. This meant keeping the introduction of new disorders to an absolute minimum. What did he mean by that? Well, his team only introduced 8 new mental disorders into the main manual, which is a modest amount compared to the 80 introduced by Spitzer. However, from another standpoint, this claim to modesty is very shaky because it excludes the following. His team actually created 30 new mental disorders, but put them in the appendix, and subdivided many existing conditions, in effect creating new ones. So if you count the appendix inclusions and the subdivisions, all of which people can and are diagnosed with, then his team expanded the DSM from around 270 disorders to around 370 disorders, which is the very opposite of modesty and conservatism. So we carried on. Yet despite that conservatism, Francis said, and I let the comment slip, we learned some pretty tough lessons. We learned overall that even if you make minimal changes to the DSM, the way the world uses the manual is not always the way you intended it to be used. Can I just pick up on that just for one moment? I'm sorry I have to, but the way the world uses the manual, so it's the world who's at fault, right? If there are any mental health professionals here in the room who in good faith use these manuals, and you do in good faith, it's your fault. It's not their fault, it's your fault, by the way. Okay. So the way the world uses the manual is not always the way intended it to be used. For instance, we added bipolar 2, Asperger's disorder, and finally, we added ADHD. And well, these decisions helped promote 3 false epidemics in psychiatry. I asked him what he meant by that. Well, we now have a rate of autism that is 20 times what it was 15 years ago. By adding bipolar 2, a milder version of bipolar, we also doubled the ratio of bipolar versus unipolar depression, resulting in lots more use of antipsychotic and mood stabilizer drugs. Rates of ADHD also tripled, partly because new drug treatments were released that were aggressively marketed. So every decision you make has a trade-off, and you can't assume the way you write the DSM will be the way it will be used. There he goes again. So the way the DSM is being used has led to the medicalization of a number of people who really don't warrant their diagnoses. Exactly. Can you put a figure on how many people have been wrongly medicalized? There is no right answer to who should be diagnosed. There is no gold standard for psychiatric diagnosis. So it's impossible to know for sure. But when the diagnosis rates triple over the course of 15 years, my assumption is that medicalization is going on. Powerful statement for him to make. He was the chairperson of DSM-4. But could the situation be even worse than this? I would argue absolutely it could be, and it is. Because he's only talking about the 8 disorders he put into the main manual. He's not talking about the subdivisions and the appendix inclusions, all of which medicalize more and more painful normality. He's also not talking about the existing problem of over-medicalization he allowed to live on, created by DSM-3, allowed to live on into DSM-4, right? He allowed DSM-3 to carry on. He's not talking about that either. Think of some of the disorders he allowed to live on. We had disorders like female orgasmic disorder. Yeah. Caffeine-related disorders. Stammering, stuttering, transsexualism, oppositional defiant disorder, which is something I evidently acutely suffer from. Look, nobody is suggesting that these things aren't experienced as problems by certain people. I'm sure they are. But whether or not they constitute psychiatric illnesses is another matter entirely. So my final question for Allen Francis was this. With the benefit of hindsight, why isn't it you just simply scrapped a lot of what went on before on the basis of, number one, it enjoyed woeful scientific support, and on the basis, number two, that it was much of this stuff was frankly eccentric. And this is how he responded. If we were going to either add new diagnoses or eliminate existing ones, there had to be substantial scientific evidence to support that decision. And there simply wasn't. So by following our own conservative rules, we couldn't reduce the system any more than we could increase it. Now, you could argue that that is a questionable approach, but we felt it was important to stabilize the system and not make arbitrary decisions in either direction. But one of the problems with proceeding in that way, I said, is that it assumes the DSM system you inherited from Spitzer was fit for purpose. For example, it assumes that the disorders Spitzer included and the diagnostic thresholds Spitzer's team set were themselves scientifically established. We did not assume that at all. We knew that everything that came before was arbitrary. Francis quickly corrects himself. We knew that most decisions that came before were arbitrary. I had been involved in DSM-3. I understood its limitations probably more than most people did, but the most important value at that time was to stabilize the system, not change it arbitrarily. So you are essentially saying that you set out to stabilize the arbitrary decisions that were made during the construction of DSM-3? In other words, corrected Francis, it felt better to stabilize the existing arbitrary decisions than to create a whole new assortment of new ones. And I thought that was a very good place to bring the interview to a close. All right, so one final paragraph before we have a very short break. So drawing this part of the lecture to a close, what I have discussed today, I believe, poses a serious challenge to those who embrace the conventional view that mental disorders are discrete patterns of biologically rooted pathological feeling and behavior identified by way of objective research processes. What an inspection of the construction of DSM rather reveals is that the separate disorders into which DSM organized diverse behavioral and mental phenomena were largely the outcome of vote-based judgments settled by a small, culturally homogeneous subset of mental health professionals who were socially positioned at a given time to have their judgments ratified by the institutional apparatus of the American Psychiatric Association. Now, while such judgments may indicate that a group of professionals sharing similar socio-cultural beliefs, biases, persuasions, and interests may see some things in the same way at a given point in time. They do not confirm that what they see is either objectively true, universal, or indeed stable in any verifiable sense. We're going to move on to a slightly different territory now in the second part. So in the first part, we looked at the construction of DSM, and the argument was essentially that we've expanded the definition of mental disorder